Welcome to the session, which is El Voto Femenino, Women and Suffrage in New Mexico. First, before we get started, there's a few housekeeping things. During the session, we've disabled chat for attendees, and so we're using it only as a way to send messages to all of you. So if you have questions for the panelists, or if you're experiencing technical issues and would like our assistance, please submit them through the Q&A option, which should be visible to you at the bottom of your Zoom screen, although you may have to mouse over it in order to be able to see that. You're welcome to post your questions for the panelists at any time, but please note that we'll save all of the questions to the Q&A period at the end of the session. Well, our two speakers today are Sylvia Ramos Cruz and Pamela Arden, who are both from Albuquerque, New Mexico. You can see their biographical information on the bio sketches part of the website. Sylvia, though, is a retired surgeon who has been doing a great deal of research on women's history in New Mexico since she's retired, and for that matter, even before. And Pamela is a lawyer in Albuquerque who has been very active in the women's rights and equal justice movement. And we'll start with Sylvia, and her talk is Ganaron el Voto, Suffragists in New Mexico. Sylvia? I think you're muted, Sylvia.
Thank you very much. One moment, please. Okay, I'm trying to get the right view here, the speaker view. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. And also, I want to thank the audience for being here today to celebrate women's history. Ganaron el voto. They won the vote. The women's suffrage movement in New Mexico dates from 1874, when it was first introduced in the New Mexico legislature, and ends in 1921, which is when the Constitution of New Mexico was amended to allow women to vote in all state elections. It took 46 years for women in New Mexico to convince most of the public, and perhaps more importantly, politicians and legislators, that they were entitled to the vote. Hundreds of women took part in the activities that led to that victory. Many worked through one of the various women's clubs, or one or more of the various women's clubs dedicated to improving women's lives and communities, promoting temperance and prohibition, or obtaining suffrage. I have been able to find the names of over 100 women who helped in New Mexico to win the vote, but they were the ones that were in suffrage-based organizations, or suffrage-focused organizations. There were many, many women who really helped during the process, and unfortunately, we don't have most of their names, and certainly none of their stories. They didn't write them, perhaps didn't even talk about them once they finished the campaign. Much of the work of mobilizing and training women to work for suffrage and educate the public was done by women's clubs. By 1911, there were 15 clubs scattered around New Mexico. Among them were the Albuquerque Women's Club, the Lake Arthur Mothers and Teachers Club, Las Cruces Wednesday Club, the Santa Fe Board of Trade and Library Association. For the most part, early records of the club activities are not available. Unlike national suffragists who wrote their 6 volumes of the history of women's suffrage almost as it unfolded, these women may not have realized the importance of documenting their work for the history books. As nationally, in New Mexico, the overwhelming majority of the membership of these clubs was Euro-American or Anglo women, and they were urban. That was at a time when the demographics of New Mexico showed a population of 360,350 people. 83% were rural. Almost 50% were non-English speakers. And among women, 56% were Nuevomejicanas, Euro-Americans, 37%, Native Americans, 6%, African-American and Asian-American women represented less than 1% each. Though ridiculed, suffragists worked year after year to integrate themselves into the lives of their communities. I think this tiny video from the Industrial Parade in Albuquerque, October 1914, helps illustrate that point. There were 6 divisions that day of marchers, and the women were in the 3rd division. I will play it twice because it really goes by very fast. It shows a festive atmosphere, cars full of women from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in New Mexico in 1883, and suffrage clubs that began in New Mexico in the territorial times in 1893. The sidewalks have many men and women, and I can imagine them all cheering and clapping for everybody. We see the YMCA go by. And here is the Women Christian Temperance Union wagon actually, and then bicycles. And a Votes for Women car, full of course of women, and probably more than one car dedicated to the cause of women's suffrage. As has been noted already, there are many women whose work for suffrage throughout the country is still being uncovered. Some women didn't join organizations, but worked alongside them in less formal church and community groups. Many women were kept out of white women's clubs and out of the history books and records we have become used to rely on for the history. That certainly is the case in New Mexico, where most of the suffragists I have found are Euro-American. A few are Spanish-American. I am still looking for specific evidence of African-American women in New Mexico who worked for the vote. So far, I have 2 candidates whom I include in this talk. I have no Native American or Asian American women candidates yet. As we know, men were the only ones who could vote. Women relied on them to carry their voices into the legislative chambers. Without their support, women's suffrage would not have been won. There were many men in New Mexico who worked alongside women for the vote. Had we more time, I would present some of them also. However, my intention today is to bring a few New Mexico suffragists to your attention through brief stories that highlight how rich the suffrage movement here was. The 11 women you'll meet are a diverse group born between 1852 and 1894. I will present them chronologically by age. A couple may already be known to some of you. All were college-educated, community leaders, and women of action with strongly held beliefs and some prejudices. Aside from homemakers and club women, they also were 1 rancher, 1 physician, 2 homesteaders, 2 musicians, 2 folklorists, 2 historians, 3 businesswomen, 3 writers, 3 politicians, 7 teachers, and 10 mothers. Ada McPherson Morley, whom you see on this slide, worked actively for suffrage in New Mexico longer than any other woman I have found. She was, in her words, always and ever on the alert to gain my own liberty. Disenfranchisement is a disgrace, she said. Mrs. Morley had a strong civic conscience, and even as a young woman, wrote letters to elected officials and politicians to castigate or commend them for their actions. Beginning in 1915, she wrote hundreds of letters to congressional delegates, legislators, and friends, urging them to support women's suffrage. She joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union early and later served as president. In 1890, she proposed adding a suffrage amendment to the Temperance Union's platform. The proposal was met with enthusiasm, and she was asked to head the effort. Just prior to the convention in 1910 that met to write the Constitution for the new state, the Temperance Union held what may be New Mexico's first public debate on women's suffrage. Although she was a rancher in the very rural town of Datil, raising 3 children on her own, she was an early and reliably active member of the Albuquerque Women's Club. In 1914, she joined Alice Paul's Congressional Union and worked in New Mexico to further its mission. Even as she was ailing, she participated in a very large rally held in 1916 to educate the public about suffrage and enroll members. Pictured here, she is with her mother, Mary McPherson, who was also quite an activist and a letter writer, and her sister Mamie. On her death in 1917, the Evening Herald wrote, "Great woman gone. No more brainy idealist ever lived than this Tolstoy of the Datils. Albuquerque, the state, California, and Colorado have felt the impress of her trenchant pen that was always used for uplift and reform. The emancipation of women by enfranchisement was a life work for Mrs. Morley." Mary Mcintosh Slaughter moved to New Mexico in 1881 as a bride. Her husband, William Slaughter, was a self-made businessman. While living in Albuquerque, he was one of the organizers of the New Mexico Colored Religious Society and the Colored Methodist Mission in 1882. From that mission originated the Grand Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first Black church in New Mexico that is still active in Albuquerque. The family was considered prosperous and affluent and among Santa Fe's pioneer citizens, having settled in the city in 1883. In fact, their daughter's wedding, attended by Black and white citizens, received extensive coverage in the front page of the Santa Fe, New Mexico newspaper in 1903. Mary McIntosh attended Fisk University in Tennessee and was a teacher prior to her marriage. She and William had 8 children. Her obituary states that her teachers had predicted a career for her as a writer, but she chose the career of rearing a family. Charlotte Mock's book, Bridges, New Mexico Black Women, 1900 to 1950, states that she worked on the Santa Fe Women's Board of Trade and Library Association, established in 1892. The board was a women's club whose members were Euro-American with perhaps a sprinkling of Hispanic women. Their goals were betterment of the city parks and cemetery and establishment of a library. And they also worked for suffrage. I have not yet ascertained what Mary Slaughter's role was in the organization, what it means that she worked on it. I do have a copy of a commentary in the Santa Fe Reporter in 1984 entitled, "If Color Had Not Been Their Destiny." The author states, if Mary Slaughter had been white, more than likely her name would be on the bronze plaque in the foyer of the Santa Fe Public Library, listed with the elite group of women who founded the Women's Board of Trade and Library Association in 1892. She was educated, a hard worker, wanted the betterment of her community, and had a prosperous husband, all general criteria for membership. But at that time in America, skin color was destiny. I do have a voter list from the 1926 general election in Santa Fe County. Both Mary Slaughter and her husband, Willie Slaughter, who lived on Manhattan Street, are listed as voters in that general election. So I think this qualifies her as a suffragist in my eyes. Mrs. Lula Black was born in Kentucky and was an educator and high school principal in San Francisco before she moved to Albuquerque. In 1914, she organized a home circle club with 8 other matrons for intellectual, social, and moral uplift. They held meetings in her home. Sadly, I haven't yet found records about their specific activities those early years. According to Rita Powdrell, the club's current president, it wasn't until 1925 that they began to keep more historical minutes. However, from the beginning, the club focused mainly on education, childcare, and professional advancement. They also addressed lynchings and segregation, and were most likely involved in suffrage activities. This is especially so since the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs had endorsed suffrage in 1912, and the Circle was originally part of their network. Although they worked independently, the clubs sometimes formed friendly alliances with Anglo clubs when they had specific common issues to address. The Home Circle Club is still active in Albuquerque and provides scholarships to college students. Mrs. Black was an accomplished musician and was a choir director and Sunday school supervisor at the Grand Chapel AME Church. She and her daughter Yola taught private vocal lessons and piano lessons. Yola graduated from the University of New Mexico and had what may have been the first music scholarship from the UNM School of Music. Yola married Theodore Brinson, a post office employee and violinist. The couple lived with Mrs. Black in the family home. Mr. Brinson was a vocal proponent for the rights of Afro-American citizens. In a letter to the editor of the Albuquerque Journal in 1917, he wrote in defense of a bill in the legislature that he said was misconstrued as a social equality bill. I have not yet found that bill. He went on to state that it was a civil rights bill and social equality plays no part in its construction, but only looms up as a scarecrow, ingeniously devised to deny the Negro his constitutional rights. In the debate about the bill, we read of Anglo-Americans and Spanish Americans. In our selection of New Mexico brands of hyphenates, permit me to add Afro-Americans. By and by, we will all want to feel like we are just United States citizens, thoroughly imbued with love and loyalty. That ends the quote from his letter. Lula Black and her family were activists for equal rights and justice. They had connections to the wide African-American community, including the Slaughters in Santa Fe. I believe they work for suffrage, and I will continue looking for that evidence. Deanne Lindsay led most of the women's rights suffrage and service organizations in the state. These include the Temperance Union, Federation of Women's Clubs, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1910, she lobbied members of the New Mexico Constitutional Convention to grant women school suffrage. Women had decided that going for full suffrage was going to be too hard a task, given the difficulty of amending the state's constitution, so they settled on suffrage for the time being. She organized statewide women's clubs and suffrage group meetings that focused on women's agenda for change. In 1918, during World War I, she chaired the New Mexico Women's Civilian Committee on National Defense. In that effort, she worked to attract Nuevomejicanas, New Mexican women, to join in war work, offering them leadership positions. While her husband, Washington Lindsay, was governor, she organized and hosted several strategy meetings before legislative sessions that brought together at the governor's mansion the sometimes quarreling major suffrage leaders in the state. Her work over 20 years, alongside others, helped secure laws that benefited women and children, among them raising the age of protection for girls from 20 to 14 years, the creation of juvenile courts, protection of women's community property in marriage, passage of prohibition, and of course, suffrage. Margaret Cartwright I think that slide is out of step, sorry. Margaret Cartwright is another example of how all these suffragists were adept at what we now call multitasking. She was founder and first president of the Young Women's Christian Association in Albuquerque in 1910. She was president of the Temperance Union twice, served as its superintendent of child welfare. She was also a member of Albuquerque Women's Club, Albuquerque Business and Professional Women's Club, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Dr. Cartwright practiced medicine, mainly obstetrics and gynecology, in Albuquerque for 34 years. She was Bernalillo County Chairman of the American Medical Association's Committee on Public Health and Education, and County Chairman of the Subcommittee on Affiliated Public Health. She did this all while raising 6 children, partly on her own, when her husband died in 1912. She was well known as one of the leading women physicians in the Southwest, as an active participant in all movements looking to the betterment of living conditions for women and children. Prior to moving to Albuquerque, she had been a Methodist missionary, providing medical care in Guanajuato, Mexico, for 17 years. She was fluent in Spanish. On November 24, 1920, hopefully after casting her own first presidential vote in the national election, she accompanied Governor Octaviano Larrazolo to Mexico City for the inauguration of Mexico's President-elect Obregón. This is her the downtown postcard of downtown Albuquerque at the time when she was practicing, and her office was in this building. Cora Armstrong Kellum dedicated her life to activism for women's rights. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, she joined Alice Paul in the now 98-year-long campaign to get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. She was a member of the Albuquerque Women's Club, Greater Federation of Women's Clubs, and a lifelong white ribboner. Her suffrage activities began in 1896 through the Territorial Association for Women's Suffrage. She joined the Congressional Union in 1914 and traveled several times to Washington, D.C. to lobby congressmen for suffrage prior to 1920, and after that to lobby for the Equal Rights Amendment. As chairman of New Mexico's branch of the National Women's Party and New Mexico delegate from the Women's Committee of the Council on National Defense, she met with President and Mrs. Wilson at the White House in May 1918. She said, "Mr. President, we, women of the West, are growing very restless indeed, waiting for the long-delayed passage of the federal suffrage amendment. Women in New Mexico and other states are eagerly awaiting for action on this measure in the Senate. Won't you help us?" The president said, I will do all I can. And he did. Maud McPhee Bloom grew up in a home where both parents were suffragists who had joined the New Mexico Territorial Association for Equal Suffrage in 1896. As she matured, she took part in women's club activities wherever she lived and was an active member of clubs in Las Cruces, Santa Fe, and Albuquerque. I'll go back to that slide that I skipped before. As the Albuquerque Women's Club historian, she wrote the 50th anniversary booklet in 1953. The first year of the club, they enrolled 84 women, 5 of whom were Spanish surnamed. Those 5 women are seen here on the slide. One of them, Mrs. Solomon Luna, actually was married to the most powerful man politician in the territorial legislature. He supported the school suffrage for women, and it passed, of course. In the book, which is sometimes humorous and very detailed, actually, she gives insight into 50 years of women's activism in Albuquerque and some in New Mexico. Though the club was begun for the betterment of women morally and intellectually, eventually it morphed into a political organization that activated and worked for community improvement and women's rights. This page shows her annotations having to do with the Las Vegas Women's Improvement Association, which, according to the note at the bottom in her handwriting, bought the first hearse in Las Cruces that first year that they were formed. Maud McPhee Bloom was a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the more moderate group working for the vote. As part of the Suffrage League that brought together moderate and militant factions, she met at the governor's mansion in 1918 to discuss various aspects of suffrage and strategize on how best to approach legislators during the upcoming session. She is among several New Mexico women recognized in Volume 6 of the History of Women's Suffrage for their work for the cause. Some of you may be aware of Adelina Ortero Warren, a New Mexico suffragist who is pretty well known. She was born into two well-to-do, well-connected, politically influential New Mexico families. That sparked her interest in politics and community service. She attended college at a time when most women didn't even finish high school. She lived in New York City from 1912 to 1914, keeping house for her brother, who was at Columbia University. While there, she volunteered at a settlement house where she provided direct services and worked to reshape public policy toward poor and working families. Settlement houses also advocated for women's suffrage. Her work for women's suffrage in New Mexico began alongside her uncle Solomon Luna in 1910 at the Territorial Convention, where women only got the franchise for the school board. When the Congressional Union came to New Mexico in 1914, she joined and was one of only 6 Hispanic registered members. She was fully bilingual and worked to educate the public about how women casting their own votes would benefit families and communities. Through her leadership in both Spanish American and Euro-American communities, she rose to be chair of the New Mexico branch of the National Woman's Party in 1917. The same year, she was appointed school superintendent in Santa Fe. For years, she deftly worked with congressional members in Washington, D.C., and with the New Mexico legislature to rally and steady their support for women's vote. During the final day of the New Mexico legislature's special session, February 18, 1920, she stayed with the Republican caucus, the first woman allowed ever into that chamber, and overcame forces of resistance from patriarchal clergy and politicians who were not ready to accept women as equals in the voting booth. The women won. Isabella Selmes Ferguson's early life was spent among socialites and the families of both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt in New York. In 1910, she moved to Silver City with her husband, who had tuberculosis, their 3 children, her mother, and childhood nanny. There, they initially lived in tents in the sanatorium compound and later homesteaded in the Burro Mountains. Periodically, they were visited in their quite rustic abodes by both Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their families. Of her, it was said, she was a peculiar blend of, She was a peculiar blend of Eastern establishment aristocracy and frontierswoman. She was an independent woman and an activist, and actually in 1934, after moving to Arizona, she became Arizona's first woman representative in Congress. In 1912, She canvassed in Silver City, however, for Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party that advocated for women's suffrage in its platform. That was her first foray into politics. She was a member of the Silver City Women's Club, which endorsed suffrage in 1914, and served on the Grant County Board of Education. In 1918, she was asked to head the Women's Land Army, part of the Women's Council on the Committee of National Defense. Her task was to bring in the crops planted by men who had gone off to war. 500 farmerettes joined her. Conditions were harsh, 10 hours in the fields and over 100-degree weather, bedding down at day's end on alfalfa and pine boughs. And actually, that was during the 1918 influenza pandemic. In fact, Isabella helped nurse some of her workers until they could be taken to hospitals. Nevertheless, those women did the job and even smiled. Service during the war helped women show they were capable of tackling men's work while doing their own and of functioning in the world of politics. It showed women as able organizers and flexible managers. Of course, they could handle the vote. Soledad Chavez de Chacon was born into a well-established, influential New Mexico family. She received a degree in accounting from the Albuquerque Business College, married, and had 2 children. She was a member of several women's clubs, including the Albuquerque Women's Club. She worked alongside Nina Otero Warren during the fight for women's suffrage in the late teens. Once women's suffrage became the law of the land, both political parties in New Mexico saw that having women on their tickets would be advantageous to them. After all, women had worked for a long time for suffrage and had turned out in great numbers in 1920 to vote. Soledad Chavez Chacon was one of the women they asked to run for office in 1922. She agreed and won both the nomination and the election. Thus, she became the first woman Secretary of State in New Mexico and the first Hispanic woman in the nation to win statewide elected office. She served 2 terms, winning re-election handily. She was praised for her work by historian Charles Cohen, who wrote, "It is generally understood that the affairs of the office were never in better order than under Mrs. Chacon's administration." In 1924, she became acting governor of New Mexico when Governor Henkel was out of the state for 2 weeks. Lieutenant Governor Baca had died in office, and Chavez Chacon was next in line to preside. For those 2 weeks, she fulfilled all the responsibilities of the office, even traveling in the state to settle disputes. She was, in effect, New Mexico's first Hispanic woman governor and the nation's first woman governor elected and acting. Of this, she said, "The hand of destiny provided her that opportunity. I believe it was the many hands of women who put their hands to the plow to work for suffrage, and that's what got Soledad Armijo Chavez Chacon the opportunity to be elected to the state office." In 1934, she was elected to the New Mexico House of Representatives and was in her 2nd year in office when she sadly died of peritonitis. Her daughter, Lena Ward, said that her mother enjoyed her service in state government. She had been a career-minded woman when she completed her education and felt her dreams were being fulfilled. Aurora Lucero presents a case in point about women's work for suffrage being disregarded. A 4-page article about her published in 1960 in a Santa Fe magazine said nothing about her skills as an orator. Yet in 1911, as a 17-year-old, she gave an impassioned speech urging the continued teaching of Spanish in public schools that was celebrated throughout the Southwest. Worse than that, the article said nothing about her work to secure the vote for women in New Mexico. That work began when the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage came to New Mexico in 1914. She was then 19 years old and already, as I said, a celebrated bilingual orator and also a teacher in a town called Tucumcari. Like Nina Otero Warren, her cousin, she was politically well-connected. Her father, Antonio Lucero, was New Mexico's first Secretary of State. She joined the union and worked with Otero Warren to reach the Spanish-speaking population. They designed and distributed Spanish-language promotional flyers. Her speech at a large rally, El porvenir de los niños, the future of children, stressed the health and well-being of children as reasons for women to have the ballot. The large Spanish-American audience responded favorably, and many joined the campaign. Here she is pictured. She worked for the WPA. She was about 35 years old here, working for the WPA editing, and I expect also writing. In 1915, there was a deputation of Santa Fe of 150 suffragists who went to ask Senator Thomas Catron, to support women's suffrage. The photo shows some of the women and Senator Catron. 4 women spoke that day, and Aurora Lucero went first. She began with, "I speak for the Spanish-American women who want the best possible laws when their home life is the question at issue." Altogether, the 4 women spoke briefly, of course. They were Ms. Lucero, Mrs. Asplund, Mrs. Cleofas Romero, and Mrs. Ella St. Clair Thompson, who was an organizer for the Congressional Union. Mrs. Asplund, this is Aurora Lucero, and I expect this is Mrs. Mrs. Cleofas Romero, sorry. The senator, however, was not moved. The very next year, he was defeated in his primary run for the United States Senate. Andrews Jones took his place. He was very supportive of women's suffrage. Most likely, women had had enough of the patriarchy and were able to move their male relatives and friends who cast the vote that cast Senator Catron out and set the stage for women across the country to win the vote. In this research, I have been helped by librarians, archivists, historians, professional and amateur, and museum volunteers who have found records buried in boxes and stored in unlikely places and searched through archives as best they could during this pandemic. Digital archives have helped enormously. I was fortunate also to speak with Maud McPhee Bloom's son, Dr. John Bloom, who graciously allowed me to look through her records. It has been, as you all know, painstaking work to unearth these women's stories. I am indebted to all of those people who helped me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. Our next speaker is Pamela Arden, who will be speaking. The topic of her paper is African-American Women in the Suffrage Movement, the Betrayal and Resurrection of Their Voting Rights. Pamela?
Well, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here with you all and to tell this story. You know, the story doesn't seem to be recorded in any place at all. So I tried to create something that looked like a recording. So even though I'm not a professional at this, I hope you will enjoy the concept for which I was trying to present to you. So I'm going to share my screen with you and share some ideas and some thoughts, but mainly I'm going to have a conversation with you because I want you to understand, to feel, to really embrace what African-American women were feeling during the time of women's suffrage and what they were going through. So let's just see there. So I'll need some help from the other side. Can you see my screen? Is it coming up correctly?
I don't see a screen. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a green button that says share screen. Click on that and then it will, there you go.
There it goes, I see. Okay, we will do it right. Thank you. We've only practiced this a million times, so why not have it go wrong when you get ready to try it?
Right now we're seeing a Word document. Is that what you'd like us to see?
No, you should see a PowerPoint that says Black women in the suffrage movement. Are you not seeing that?
No, we're seeing a Word document.
Okay.
So you can click Stop Share.
Okay.
And then hit that green button again for share screen, but then it will pop up some options of which screen you want to show. So click on the one that's your PowerPoint.
Now, can you see it?
Yes, now I see a PowerPoint. Great.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much for walking me through that. So as we talk about Black women in the suffrage movement and the betrayal and resurrection of their voting rights, we tried to put together this whole concept of what that looked like. Because for Black women, it was always important to embrace their feelings in song, for example. And the song often told the story of how they were feeling. So we tried to put something together that would look exactly like that. So bear with me as we show you the concept of what we tried to do. And let's see if we'll make it work. Is the sound coming through?
We're seeing your PowerPoint. So what you might want to do here again is stop the screen share and then start it again and make sure you have the Vimeo window highlighted.
Okay, the Vimeo screen is actually input inside the PowerPoint. So if it's not coming up, I'll stop sharing. I will just stop that and not show that because it is not showing correctly.
Yes, unfortunately, we're just seeing the PowerPoint. Do you want to try clicking again and see if it works this time?
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, now we see it.
Okay, so I understand. I think I'll have to stop it and start it again to get back to the PowerPoint.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear it?
And sometimes
Yes.
it's hard to tell the night from day. Still the hope that lies within is reassured as I keep my eyes upon the distant shore. I know he'll lead me safely to that blessed place that he has prepared. Hello, my name is Pamela Arden. I'm the CEO of KWH Law Center for Social Justice and Change. I'm going to tell you the story today of the fight and the struggle for Black women to get the right to vote. They always knew that they would get the right to vote. The question was simply when and where I enter. Although Black women's contribution to the suffrage campaign was rarely recorded, Black women had a consistent philosophy of universal suffrage. They said, everybody has the... Though the storms keep on raging in our life, and sometimes it's hard to tell the night from day. Still the hope that lies within is reassured as I keep my eyes upon the distant shore. I know he'll lead me safely through that blessed place that he has prepared. Black women found themselves fighting racism and sexism simultaneously as they struggled for the right to vote. But what was interesting about this period is that there were a number of men who were over the clergy at the time, who said, you know, there's no divine law that separates men and women. They are all treated the same. But when it comes for women in the political arena, they are not treated equally. We think there is a difference. This hurt Black women because they felt that they deserved to be supported in every single aspect of their lives. I realize sometimes in this life, we're gonna be tossed by the winds and the currents that seem so fierce. But the word of God, I've got an anchor. It keeps me steadfast, unmovable, despite the tide. The suffrage movement spanned a period that witnessed the changing status of women. From slavery to freedom, from rural to urban, from being illiterate to being literate, from being unskilled to going to skilled professional areas. None of these deterred them, however, and Black women continued to work to be a part of the suffrage movement. The Alpha Suffrage Club, organized by Ida B. Wells in Chicago, found that many women were told that they should be home taking care of babies, not trying to wear the trousers of the family. But W.E.B. Du Bois, who took Frederick Douglass's place as the leading male feminist of this time, said, you know what? In order for the Black race to be lifted, every single person must have the right to vote. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. Anchored in the Lord. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. Anchored in the Lord. Billows may roll. Breakers may dash. But I shall not sway because he holds me fast. Though dark the days, clouds up in the sky, I know it's all right because Jesus is nigh. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored, y'all. Anchored in the Lord. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. When the focus turned to suggesting that educational requirements should be the standard for determining whether or not a person should have the right to vote, Black women simply shook their head and they said, who are you to determine whether or not there should be a vote given to Black women? And then they said, well, that will be fraud if we have so many Black women voting. We can't keep up with all of this. And Black women said, you cannot make that statement. You whose hands have lynched Black people, you whose hands have killed Black people when there was no reason at all to do it, but for the color of their skin. It is because of those women that I can say I have the opportunity to champion the rights of women to vote, to support those who advocate against discrimination, and to make sure that we are electing people who support civil rights and social justice, and they are the ones who lead the democracy of our country. And thank you. My soul has been anchored, y'all. My soul has been anchored. My soul has been anchored, y'all. Anchored in the Lord. My soul, my soul, my soul has been anchored in the Lord.
So there you got a taste of what Black women were feeling as they would participate in the whole feeling of the suffrage movement. You got to feel the strength of the songs. You got to feel how they could put their feelings into song, and then the story that they wanted to tell. So Black women found themselves, as you heard, fighting fighting racism and sexism simultaneously as they struggled for the right to vote. First slavery, and then later there was poverty that were the barriers that confronted Black women as they tried to gain rights to vote. And in a book by a woman by the name of Rosalind Turbuck, in it she calls her book African-American Women in the Struggle for the Vote, the Right to Vote, 1850 to 1920. And she presents a vivid description of the changes in the status of African-American women throughout the course of women's suffrage. So when the suffrage movement began in 1848, most Black women were still in the bondage of slavery. And Turbuck chronicles how Black women went through slavery to freedom. And she talks about how they went from a rural environment to an urban environment, and from being illiterate to having a variety of professions, which range from real estate salespeople, restaurant owners, and entertainers. Now let's review some of the major dates in history that may have influenced when and how Black women, particularly as we look at them in the state of New Mexico, how they interacted with the suffrage movement. We're going to try to share that screen again, and we're going to test your knowledge on those dates.
We're seeing a Vimeo screen.
Okay. Stop that screen and we'll fix it. We'll try to share that again. Well, I will tell you that if we can't make it work, we will move ahead without it. To make that Vimeo screen disappear in an environment on this screen, it seems like it doesn't want to do that. So it's okay. We'll try it without it, and we will move to.
Are you trying to get back to your PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So when you click on the share screen button, does it give you some options to choose?
Yes, but the one option that keeps showing is that Vimeo screen, which is embedded in the PowerPoint. And it won't move.
I see. And you can't, when you open up, you can't close that Vimeo tab. Try opening up your PowerPoint again from scratch.
Okay. Let's see if I can do that. Well, it's okay. I can't seem to make it disappear even when I try to open it from scratch. And we'll try one more thing, and if it doesn't work this time, then it'll be okay. So it is showing up for me, but it won't show up on this on the screen, unfortunately. Let me see. I'll try one last time to make it disappear. And let's see if that works. Nope, that doesn't work. So we'll just move forward without it. I'll go back out. Let's see. It's okay. We'll just move forward without it. So what I'll do is just tell you what some of the dates are, and so give you something to think about. So if we start looking at 1848, the suffrage movement, we saw that beginning in Seneca Falls, New York. But where were Black women during that time, particularly would they have been in New Mexico? Well, the answer was probably not. And if there were some, they were very, very few. Then what happened in 1850? In 1850, we would be looking at New Mexico becoming a territory. And then in 1865, we would be looking at the passage of the 13th Amendment. It was passed abolishing slavery. So you see what we were looking at is Black women having to overcome one, that New Mexico was not even a state. It was not a territory until 1850. And so would they have been involved in a suffrage movement? So the answer is probably not. And then in 1865, when the 13th Amendment was passed, we are still seeing New Mexico as being a territory. And we are seeing Black women for the first time finding themselves being free. And so then in 1868, this is another major date that was occurring. And in that date, we saw the 14th Amendment passed. And then in 1870, another major date that would be affecting African-American women and the suffrage movement, we saw the 15th Amendment passed. And with the 15th Amendment, that gave Black men the right to vote, but not Black women. And it didn't give white women the right to vote either. And we're going to talk just for a moment about why that made a difference and what happened with respect to the passage of that 15th Amendment and the overall women's suffrage movement. And so when we go back to the 14th Amendment, remember that was in 1868, that what we saw was the amendment that actually gave citizenship to slaves. So we saw the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, all these civil rights amendments that were being passed. And then in 1875, we saw something incredibly exciting happen. We saw the Civil Rights Act of 1875 come about. It passed, granting equal access to public accommodations to every single person without regard to race, creed, or nationality. But then in 1863, we saw the Supreme Court back step on that Civil Rights Act. And we saw some major changes regarding regarding access to accommodation, and the Supreme Court ruling and saying, well, you know what? You have no right, legislature, to pass that Civil Rights Act of 1875, because in doing so, you do not have any right to step on the works of private people and whether or not they admit or deny access to anyone. So they had to live with that law. I just want you to know until 1965. But moving forth until we'll move forward to other major dates that occur. So in 1890, we saw the emergence of women's clubs being formed around the country, but Black women were not necessarily welcomed in those clubs. So we saw them forming their own clubs. And then in 1903, if we're still looking at the state of New Mexico and how and when and where African-American women were entering the suffrage movement, we saw the development, the establishment of the Blackdom Township Company. It was incorporated by 13 Black families in the small town near Roswell, New Mexico. And then finally, we see 1912 occur when New Mexico becomes a state. And so in the year that it became a state, maybe we're going to see more and more activity by African-American women as they become more and more involved in the suffrage movement. So now as the suffrage movement progressed, there was much disagreement over giving Black men the right to vote. Remember, we talked about that 15th Amendment and that 15th Amendment occurring in 1870. And so with respect that there was a great deal of a discourse that arose between Black women and white women because of some things that were said that were extremely hurtful. For example, Susan B. Anthony is quoted as saying, "I will cut off my right arm before I will ever work or demand for the ballot for a Negro and not that, and I will not be fighting for women." She says, "I'm not going to do that. That will never happen." But now, even before that, let's look at what Sojourner Truth was saying. She commented in a newspaper article, "I feel that I have the right to have just as much as a man." She went on to say that there is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about colored women. And if colored men get their rights and colored women don't get theirs, and we're just leaving slavery, she said, then colored men will be the masters over women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So we have two different views, but all saying the same thing. Why should we give men the right to vote if us women don't have it? But Black women who were strong supporters for themselves and for what they believed in said that the suffrage movement shall go forward. And so there's a woman by the name of Anna Julia Cooper, who is best known for her statement that says, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence or special patronage, and there is no one who can be there to tell me or the Negro race when and where we enter. We will make that decision." So Cooper was particularly effective when she was describing how women, particularly Black women, were going to enter the right to vote and enter the suffrage movement and to move that whole process forward. She said that Black women will be given the right to vote. She said, Black men's experiences is what people are often saying is the same as women's experiences. So why should we give Black women the vote? And she said, that is not true. There is no way that Black women's experiences are the same as Black men. So you must give Black women the right to vote. So what was most disheartening through all of this, I will tell you as I was reading books and as I was talking to individuals, is the fact that as the process moved closer and closer to getting the 19th Amendment passed, that there was a movement by white women who were willing to push Black women to the back or to push them aside if it made a difference on whether or not the 19th Amendment passed. And they all thought, according to Black women, that they were working together for the same goal and to achieve the same thing. But it wasn't happening, and that was quite hurtful to them. For Black women, the right to vote represented the key to their empowerment. It was a part of their demand for equality, and they were willing to engage in bold behavior to maintain that equality. And let me give you an example of what that looks like. So in 1913, when a huge suffrage march was being organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association that was to take place in Washington, D.C., the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, Ida Wales Barnett was told she could not march with the all-white Chicago contingent of suffragists for fear of offending Southern women. Well, Ida B. Wells says, I'm not having any part of this. And she said, I will not be deterred. She staked out at a strategic place in the crowd of onlookers. And as the delegation from Chicago passed her, she slipped into the line between two embracing white women and marched as she pleased. And at that point, there was nothing that could be done or nothing that anyone could say about it. That was her bold move for Black women in a step towards suffrage. And throughout my research, like Sylvia said, we couldn't find many written accounts about how Black women in New Mexico were a part of the suffrage movement. So in telling this story, I decided to go around to as many Black families as I could find in New Mexico who may have had their original origin right here in New Mexico by the fact of their early movement here as a part of that development of Blackdom, or for some other reason that may have brought them to New Mexico to help out, to work out, to be a part of this territory before it became a state. So the Alpha Suffrage Club organized by Ida Wells Barnett in Chicago, found that many women were told that they should stay home and take care of babies. Well, in New Mexico, what we found when these women's clubs were formed, it wasn't necessarily because they thought they should stay home and take care of babies, but they were forming these clubs because what they wanted to do was make sure that the morals and the strength of women was always maintained, and those clubs gave them an opportunity to come together. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, who I talked about earlier, who took Frederick Douglass's place as the leading male feminist of his time, said that political empowerment of a race cannot be complete until both men and both women, both Black men and Black women, have the right to vote. So when the focus turned to suggesting those educational requirements and why that you must be highly educated before you could vote, and we told that story, that is absolutely insane. If I can read and I can write, I should be able to vote. There should be no other hierarchy in determining whether or not Black women have the right to vote. We do know that hundreds and hundreds of Black women's clubs were formed, and that they mobilized for the vote during the years from 1900 to 1920. We do not know how many women total in New Mexico were a part of those clubs, but what we do know is that around the time that Blackdom was created, and remember that was back in 1903, that there were only a total of about 220 Black people total. The census didn't tell us quite how many were men and how many were women, but we do know that there were 220 Black people. So we can sort of guess that maybe if it was half or of men and women without regard to children, that's the number of Black women who would have been involved in these clubs. But some of these clubs were formed in churches, some were formed in neighborhoods to aid the community, and others were affiliated with national organizations, such as the Baptist Women's Convention or the National Association of Colored Women. But the big question is, how were they moving toward the right to vote? So as I talked to more and more of these families in New Mexico and talked about the suffrage movement, I found about 4 women's clubs that I could identify. One was the Colored Women's Club in New Mexico. And although the club focused somewhat on voting, the club had a stronger focus, again, on protecting the morals and the good character of women. When looking at the suffrage movement and the vote of Black women in New Mexico and the role that they played in voting, I recognized that women had a greater interest in the well-being and the strength of their family, and they thought that voting would come along to accentuate it, but they would not give up making sure that their families were strong and that their character was kept in place. So I did discover information about a woman by the name of Pearl A. Hicks Foster. So she was an early day voter registrar, and she was heavily involved in politics. And as a matter of fact, she would try to make sure that people made it to polls and to rallies, or to the voting polls and to rallies, because that was incredibly a part of her work as her involvement with the Colored Women's Club of Albuquerque. And at one point in time, I found out that she was the president of the organization. So there was subsequently an office of the Federated Colored Women's Club, which grew out of what was happening in New Mexico. And so that office was subsequently used as a community gathering place and as a site to instruct young people in etiquette and public speaking. Because remember again, Black women wanted to make sure that the strength and the good character of their families always stayed in place, as they also continued to move toward voting. Then there was something called the Home Circle Club that you heard Sylvia talking about in Albuquerque. And you heard her talk about this woman named Lula S. Black, who settled in Albuquerque in 1880. So the club was originally a part of the Colored Women's Federation Club network. And it was an organization originally for young married women to exchange cultural and literary information. And the Home Circle Club subsequently became independent, and it moved away from the Colored Women's Federation Club because there were all these requirements that they had to attend meetings or they had to do all this traveling. And they said, but that's not helping to build the strength of our family. So we'll do something different. We'll back away from that. We'll participate as much as we think we can, but we will be an independent organization. And so the club, it still exists today in the state of New Mexico. I want you to know that. And today it's still building upon the strength of families and morals and good character and making sure that young women coming up will have access to get education through scholarships and other areas that will help them to advance their lives. So as I also had the opportunity to talk to a woman by the name of Brenda Dabney. And so Brenda Dabney resides in Albuquerque, and her mother was actually one of the founders of the Home Circle Club. And various members of her family were engaged in lucrative businesses around Albuquerque. But what she did know and what she did remember was the name of another club, and it was called the Eureka Matrons Club, and that they were absorbed ultimately into the Colored Women's Federated Club. So the Home Circle Club members also partnered with other groups around the state that focused on Black people as they worked to try to help give Black women the right to vote. And the group was originally, when they began, they would host meetings in their own homes, and they would provide lunch for each other on great china and silverware as they talked about what their strategies were going to be. When we look at other Black women's clubs that were going on around the country, we found that the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was an American organization that was founded in 1896. And remember, we saw these women's clubs organizations being founded toward the end of the 19th century. And we also saw them adopt mottos that included things like, as we lift, we climbed. We're lifting as we climb because we lift ourselves and we move ourselves forward. So we also saw the National Federation of Afro-American Women that was formed during these women's clubs times. And we also saw many, many delegates that you might recognize now by name, a woman by the name of Margaret Murray Washington. She became the president. She was the wife of Booker T. Washington. There was a woman by the name of Flora Ruffin Ridley. She was one of the main characters or features. A character is not the right word, but one of the main individuals who helped to form these women's organizations that had the strength of the national aspect, but had not quite come to New Mexico to embrace the few women that were here. What we did see is that by July 29th, 1895, that there were 42 Black women's clubs that were existing in 14 states, including Washington, D.C. We also saw that women's movement was a movement that was directed for the good of women and men and for the benefit of all humanity. And it wasn't just for themselves, because remember, as they lift, they climb, because they believed as one person was lifted, the entire country was lifted. And so they wanted to see everybody lift at one time. We also saw that many of these clubs absolutely supported and made sure that women would continue to go to school and to get their degrees. And as they would learn more and more, they would be involved in voting, and that voting would be a part of their lives. We saw that there was a woman by the name of Eliza Ann Gardner of Boston, who gave an opening benediction at one of these women's clubs meetings. And what was so interesting about this is that Black women normally were not convention chaplains. where they would be in the position to give a benediction. But she was one of the unheard of Christian women who were able to preach and be a part of growing strength of African-American women as they grew not only in the right to vote, but in their stature in many, many other ways. So what happened after the 19th Amendment was passed? Where were Black women in New Mexico? Well, one of the things you heard Sylvia talk about even before the 19th Amendment was passed was the right that these women had to vote in what was called school board elections. And that was the extent of what they could do. No matter how hard they tried to get the Constitution of the state of New Mexico to allow them to vote, they couldn't get it to happen. But once the 19th Amendment was passed, what we saw, including in the state of New Mexico, a total of about 3 million Black women who were waiting for the right to vote. And 3/4 of them were in the South. And it was, for example, it was votes by Black women who got Oscar DePriest elected as the first Black alderman in Chicago. And that was quite a euphoric moment in Black history. And there were various other women's clubs who were able to help watch that happen and say, how can we make that happen in New Mexico one day? So women voted with enthusiasm in New Mexico. I want you to know that, with participation rates among Hispanic women is what we saw being exceedingly high and much higher than we saw for white women. But there were reports that no matter what happened, when Black women were given the right to vote, they voted every time a poll was open. So I just want to tell you and end with this one story, and it's about my grandmother, whose name is Johnetta Wade King. So she was not allowed to vote for many, many years. And my mother, I can remember struggling to pay for the poll tax that was required to vote in the state of Texas, where she was, right next door to New Mexico. And so she said, no matter what happens, I'm going to make sure that this poll tax is paid because voting means a lot to me. And that was the same story that I was hearing from the families in New Mexico. And I talked to other women in this state who were traveling in and out, and they were here because they were with their husbands who were in the military. There were people like Doris Jackson, Laverne Hanks, and Mrs. Carrington, Mrs. Dora Carrington. And they said as military wives, they thought that their access to the vote was very different. They couldn't remember having any very big barriers that stood in front of them, but they said one thing they do remember is they voted every time they could. It is because of all these women today that New Mexico's suffrage story exemplifies diversity of women and of the varied interactions they had with the political process. So it didn't matter where you were as a Black woman, what geography, what religion, what race, they all played a crucial role in whether or not Black women got to vote. But the one thing that was a common thread between them all is that they did vote. And thank you.
I'm going to turn the.
Thank you, Pamela and Sylvia, two really interesting talks. And I confess that I didn't know very much about the suffrage situation in New Mexico. So this is really, it's a very, very complex state, much more complex racially than many other places. And we'd perhaps have a chance to talk further about that. We already have one question from Sylvia or from Celia. And both of you have done really impressive research about tracking down descendant families and descendant clubs. And I wondered if you were able to locate personal papers as part of that process. And is there any possibility of those papers winding up in historical collections somewhere so that other people can wind up doing historical research?
Oh, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was able, as I mentioned in my talk, to speak with Maud McPhee Bloom, who was Bloom's son. She was a suffragist, and he gave me access to her papers. And I am sure that he will be donating them to an archive in New Mexico. I also have other papers, and all of them will go at some point to an archive so that we can have more information about the suffragists in New Mexico. I have not been able to speak with any other relatives of suffragists, although I know that Adelina Ortero Warren has relatives who are active in the community.
So if you remember the story I told about Blackton, so one of the founding families there was a family called the Boyer family. So what I understand is, of course, Mrs. Boyer and her husband have passed away, but somewhere in that house, I have been told, are lots and lots of records. And as I talked to the woman named Brenda Dabney, I've asked her to help get those papers because what's trying to be formed in the state of New Mexico is something called the African-American Museum. And so the idea is to put those papers as a part of that museum.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, yeah, if anyone else has questions, please post them to the Q&A box. There's a link at the bottom of your Zoom box where you can type in there and you can read them. Actually, to follow up on the question about documentation, I wondered if either of you have participated in oral history projects as a way of creating documentation where all you have are people's memories of activities rather than actual papers.
I certainly have not, but it sounds to me like that's some of what Pamela is trying to do, is to have people speak with her and hopefully record them. Is that right, Pamela?
That is right. There is a woman in Chicago right now, and I'm thinking that I get this name right. It's called the History Project, I believe it is. But what she does is she goes around the country to get these oral stories. And so I did interview with her to tell her the story of my family. But what we want to see have happen here, and with the help of Sylvia, because she's such a great archivist, to help create a similar type of situation right here in the state of New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an oral project that she started, the woman in Chicago. And they were to meet this year for a big anniversary, but unfortunately the COVID-19 pandemic hit, so it wasn't allowed to occur. But if you go online, you can see that history project and see the many, many stories, particularly of African Americans who are embedded in that project.
Right. Yeah, I think that's History Associates, and yeah, it's a really exciting program. And Celia has actually just raised another question. I'm curious about the song Pamela shared. What circumstances in which that was recorded, and this looks like actually this also looks like a presentation that you had done in some other settings and not just for this conference.
So this year, as you know, well, actually in 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. And so what we were trying to do was actually put together a tribute to Black women voting. And so as we put that together, I knew that at some point in time, we would have an opportunity to play it, hopefully in this setting. And there are still lots and lots of irons that have to be worked out with that. But my soul has been anchored in, is a gospel song that has been around for a while. And what the woman who was singing that was a woman by the name of Rayetta Beatty. And so we were trying to find a song that said, no matter how many trials and tributes that I may face, that I'm going to stay anchored in my religion, because that was a strong part of the African-American culture, and that there was always the belief that things would work out right. And so that was the concept we were trying to bring in as a part of that presentation, So we'll work on it a little bit more. We'll also work on learning how to use a Zoom so that we can show things and move a slide presentation.
Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I just want to draw your attention to the chat where Sylvia has posted a note that this was originally to be a 3-paper panel, and Diane Layton, who was supposed to be part of this, had an accident right before this conference, and so wasn't able to participate. But she has a paper with the intriguing title of the 19th Amendment and the Violence Against Women Act. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can email Sylvia, or I think there's also Diane's email address posted in the chat. So, so thank you all for coming to this session, and thank you very much, Pamela and Sylvia, for your excellent and intriguing presentations, and good luck with your further work. It sounds like you're doing tremendous things to bring out the history of women in New Mexico.
Thank you very much, Eric. We appreciate it.
Yes. And did you notice we were both wearing purple today?
Coincidentally.
So thank you.
Okay.
It's been our pleasure.
Okay. Thank you.